purification process is going inward and doing the work that is required of us to identify the light from the dark elements within us and working towards altering the dark within us towards the light so that we can change that balance so that we become more and more and more moving towards the light than we are literally towards the middle road, so to speak here, where we've got equal amounts of both. We want to start becoming more and more compatible to higher and higher realities rather than being stuck here in the worlds between good and evil. We want to move to the worlds of light. We want to graduate. The awakening phase, often for many souls, will start out with positive experiences. We are often taken into these positive experiences to get us more grounded and ready to deal with things that are going to be more intense further down the path. What can sometimes happen, and this is one of the important things during the awakening period, is that it's important not to think that when you have your first experience or your first, whether it's an out-of-body experience or if it's some other type of spiritual awakening, because people sometimes have different types where it comes to them in different ways, that what you have seen or what you have experienced is all that there is to know. And what sometimes happens, because people don't realize, okay, you've touched that tip of that iceberg. I remember the first time I had it was probably my second or third out-of-body experience beyond what I had at the age of 9. When I first started having them at the age of 22, it was like the second or third. I'm like, wow, I'm like, oh my gosh, how did I know? How could anyone know? There's so much. I could not have fathomed how much more was coming. So it's good to have that hindsight of knowing there is always going to be more. And now, I've had so much now that I know that there's always more, that God is too big for any of us as human beings to comprehend. So there's always going to be more. And so we can only speak to that which we've seen. In the awakening phase, a lot of times it will be very positive. There are some people who have some experiences that are different. That none of it is exactly the same across the board, but there are some, these phases that I describe are pretty similar to what people will go through. A lot of what happens in the awakening phase is the beginning stuff. You experience being out of your body, and then you also learn how to experience vision, sight, smell, hearing in the consciousness rather than the physical body. Then you have to learn things like, how do I move? And then how do I move through physical objects? All of these things require some training and trial and error. And then you start learning more, like you do a little bit around the astral plane, and then you start learning about corridors, and so you're going to start there. A lot of times people will start in the awakening with past life memories and things like this, and you're going to start also with your initial teachers. Whatever your initial teachers are going to be, my initial ones began about the concepts of oneness, and that was with a teacher that I had named Emmanuel, and that's not the same as Jesus. He was a different Emmanuel. and it goes on to different teachers. And so that's a lot of what happens in that primary awakening phase. Co-creation is when you're learning a lot about how creation itself works and how we work in co-creation with God. And we also find out a lot about the creative spirits and the types of creative energies that are around us individually for the type of work that we are going to be involved in. So if you are a creative person, like writer, painter, artist, musician, all those kinds of things, there's all kinds of realms where creation originates from, and these kinds of things will be introduced to you. But if you're like a scientist or a mathematician, that's a whole nother sphere of it. Whatever your particular sphere of vocation is in life, it will have a corresponding place of training where you're going to receive the creative energies that come from God and where it will be enhanced. It's a really exciting time because there's a lot of really fun things that you get to experience and see, and there's a lot of acceleration during that period, tons of acceleration, because it's all about getting you primed in your gifts. There's a lot of that going on. Lots of vibrational raisings during that period, and lots of really cool, beautiful realms you get to visit, because these are the realms of creation. This is beautiful places. I remember going to like the planet of the Assisi Marauders and the Temple of the Dolphins, the cloudy realm where the different musicians were practicing their instruments, crystal cities in the skies. That was also when I went to the Crystal Forest, which has the crystal rivers and the trees with the crystal leaves. I mean, come on. That's a time of great beauty. You're just seeing the spectacular. That's when I was also introduced to my white-winged horse. His name is Saint Harmony Crystal Fire. Wow. One of those memorable times I would get to go out of my body. My white-winged horse would be waiting for me, and I'd get to fly to the planet of the Assisi Marauders and learn about how creation works in all sorts of little molecular ways. Oh, it was so awesome. Just lots of really neat things in that period. Lots of really cool things there. There is a big period there where you literally are learning how to surrender to the spirit, because when you're learning about creation, you're finding that there is a flux of energy where there is impetus and then pulling back, impetus and pulling back, and that's the surrender. And so when you're in the time of impetus, you have to discipline yourself to be doing exactly what God is instructing you to do, the inspiration of what you need to do. But then when that phase has passed, then you go into the surrender, where you have to surrender and allow the energy to do its work. And that applies as well to what's happening in your soul. This also happens in your out-of-body travel experiences, where you're going to see that movement. So you're pulling forward, you're pulling back, you're pulling forward, you're pulling back, pulling forward, you're pulling back. And so you're learning how to surrender to the spirit. There are actually a lot of rituals that you go through to learn how to release your own control of the mind in the moment so that God can take over. And it's interesting because when I was back doing those things, you're out of your body, you're in your spirit, you're stationary, you have a teacher who is telling you, I need you to surrender, I'm going to teach you what to do, and I'm going to do this and this and this and this, and I want you to just surrender to what I'm doing. You go through these different phases of it, but when you actually reach that moment where you surrender to God, literally what happens is it's like fall back and soar, because you're literally falling into the arms of God. That's what surrender is in the spiritual journey, is allowing God to do it. And so we have this tendency as human beings to have a real hard time with surrender because we're control freaks. So the surrender process can be something we have to go through some training on, but it's really beautiful. And you do go through different levels of it that continue well beyond just that third phase there. It continues throughout. But it is a beautiful thing, because that moment that you reach it and you do it, it's literally like you fall back and all of a sudden you're soaring through space. It's amazing. The initiations into the mysteries, you are taken into this mysterious energy that goes deep beneath what you've experienced to this time. And you're being taken into what would be signs, symbols, mysterious times in history, mysteries of different religious paths. I was taken back to these initiations into the Sphinx, and what are the mysteries behind the Sphinx, the Garden of Eden. There is so much to be attained. You're continuing again with the past life retrieval. And what you're going to be moving towards near the ends of the initiations is when these past lifetimes come together as one, and you are uniting with your higher self, where your higher self is able to kind of descend into you, your higher self being the highest aspect of you. And then you're allowing this higher part of yourself to operate through vibrational raising into your body. And then you are bringing together the knowledge of all of your lifetimes into one place, into your current moment. And it's just such a powerful period, because you're traveling forward and backward in time. You're going into ancient temples and being shown mysteries of all sorts of things, Egyptian mysteries, Christian mysteries, ancient Greeks, and galactic mysteries, which will unfold even more later. It's a beautiful time, a very poetic time, which is part of the reason why the language changes in Passage to the Ancient, because it's just, you cannot speak of it in mundane language. You have to speak of it differently. You just do. That's when the karmic issues that you have been instructed about and seeing and reliving and remembering start hitting the ground. So these things start happening around you. Things from previous times begin to repeat themselves around you, and you start learning about the mysteries of karma. There is so much delusions that surround those past lifetimes that ended in vain, so to speak. You did not find your way, and you have to try to understand these things, and they become manifest. It's a difficult period because you have to literally live in this world, but you cannot just live in this world. You have to also bring that understanding from the mystical realm, the worlds of truth, into the worlds of delusion. Otherwise, you will not progress. And it's very easy to get lost there, because again, the same habitual patterns will be placed before you, and habits are habits. So it's very easy to fall into old habits and do what we've always done, but you're being challenged at that point to do something very different, and to view it very differently, to understand it very differently, to literally go into it molecularly, so that you will take it apart this time to understand it and do it differently in a way that will provide literally resurrection for yourself and for everyone who's involved. It's complicated and it's difficult because of the fact that you're learning to bring what you're experiencing in the mystical into the worldly environment. And it's made even harder by the fact that most of the time, those other people who are going to be involved in your karmic pursuits are not going to be awakened. So they're going to be doing this according to the way that they've always done it too. And so you can't assume that they're going to be like, oh, hey, yeah, we're trying to figure this out. Let's do it. Hey, they're going to be doing the same things that they've always done. And you're trying to handle it yourself from this new awakened place differently. But you have to recognize that they're not necessarily going to be doing it any differently, because they may be coming completely from the same place. So it's difficult. It's challenging. You're challenged by the complicated relational aspects that you're faced with, because you're relearning everything about, well, what is the proper way to handle these things. And we're dealing with issues of the misunderstanding of the true nature of love, eternal love, the misunderstanding of the true nature of destiny, the right use of destiny, where people get lost, where people take the wrong paths, where people do things that are inappropriate, that cause literally aborts in other people's paths. And you're trying to navigate this from a much higher perspective and alter things, and you're trying to do it without anyone else's help most of the time, because our own awakening is our own awakening. We cannot assume that other people are always going to be on that awakening path with us, especially those who have traveled the karmic pathway with us. It's just not very often the case. I can't say it's never the case, but it's not very often the case. So we have to do it, even though everyone around us may choose not to be, or may not be even capable of it. They may have no idea where you're coming from, because they may be completely on the ground. You start seeing in the people around you the things that you need to see in yourself. So a lot of examples are brought into your perimeter, where it's mirrored back to you stuff that you do not yet see about yourself. Again, self-delusions perhaps, or it doesn't even have to be all just delusions, but it can be things you don't understand or just haven't realized yet. And so you have to become more acutely aware. You become more acutely aware where you're paying closer attention when you see these other things. For instance, you see a behavior you might not like in someone else. You have to become much more acutely aware, where you can actually consider the possibility of, how is this behavior mirroring back to me? Is there something in this that I need to see that is going on within myself, that or something that I'm generating that's allowing it, or even something within myself that is similar to it that I don't realize, don't see. God places around us, in ways we least expect, opportunities for this mirroring back. The but for the grace of God go I, period, where we become compassionately aware of how similar we all are. We can all be very, very aware of the flaws of others, but not see that we're just exactly the same. It becomes a good humbling experience, but it's also an awakening thing that we see more of it. The more that we become aware of, the more we can do about what we become aware of. If we're not aware of it, we can't change anything. Part of the mirroring is becoming more and more aware, because as you proceed through purification, you're going to be working to overcome some of the things that you are recognizing through all of these processes, all of these phases, all of these things that are being brought to your attention. One of the things that happens in the out-of-body travel experience is that you're shown a lot of energetic truth about other situations, but also about yourself. So, for instance, a good example of this would be something I wrote about in Mysteries of the Redemption, where I got chastised about my use of words. It was something that I had to get chastised several times. It was brought to my attention. Energetically, it was presented to me where I could really see it energetically as an embodiment. And then energetically, it's also given to me to experience the actual real consequence of it. In several of the experiences that I had, it was shown to me to be a pool of rattlesnakes, just snakes. These things are brought to our attention. So it was brought to my attention. The energy of it is being given to me. I'm also given instructions about different texts, ancient texts I can read that will help me to become more aware of my words. And a lot of that was books on Lashon Hara and Recluse, which are from Judaism. And there's a book called Echoes in the Heavenly Court, which is by a Jewish rabbi. It's an excellent book on proper use of words. This was something that had to be brought to me. And there are lots of things, whether it was my issues with lust, whether it was my issues with losing my temper, overreacting, whatever. And these are the kinds of things that will be brought up. So as you're bringing these things to your awareness, these experiences are actually making you feel, taste, touch, and see literally your own sin. You're understanding why it's harmful, why it hurts, why it harms other people, why it harms God. You know, all these things that are brought up. The ignition of the eternal flame cannot happen until we are starting to throw some of these things off. And so a lot of these things, we're trying to literally become white as snow. As it states in the Bible, we want to start removing these elements. And so has a lot to do with the balancing of the masculine and feminine energies within our souls. But it also has, it's like a second initiation into the mysteries. Fire is part of that process, the ignition, where it's being brought. There's all these different processes where it's being lit, because it's got to be lit. And you go through the psychedelics, all the things that have to do with the psychedelic eyes and the psychedelic this and the psychedelic that, because that has to do with the eternal. The psychedelic colors, that's another subject there, but but there is a lot of like working out of the final karmic thrusts in the ignition of the eternal flame, and whatever the blocks and restraints are to balancing out as both your masculine and feminine energies within you. There's a point in there where you realize that you have to become that which you seek in order to find it. That's a big part of that. But you're bringing together these parts of your soul that are not working properly together. There's all these rites, and some of it has to do with the Phoenix, some of it has to do with Saint Joseph, some of it has to do with Buffalo Calf Woman. In the writing of the books of the eights, the introduction to the golden angels and that whole thing, the past lifetimes of meeting the people that you've known in all your past lifetimes that you had to meet in the spirit in order to be able to ignite the eternal flame and fully understand it. There were a whole bunch of things in relation to understanding the elements of change being the only constant of the eternal. The ascension has to do with what happens when the soul reaches the point where death is no longer the place that we go when we are finished here. And I had this experience where I met the angel of the ascension, wears a white robe, and his face is all light, and it shows out, and his hands are all light. He's very, very, very intense. I painted him too, but he's similar to the angels of death in that the angels of death wear the black robe and they have the skeleton for the face and the hands, whereas the angel of the ascension has the white robe and he's all light. No features in his face, and his hands have no features, they're just light. And the angel of ascension came when I had reached that point where I had ascended beyond the point where I would need to return to this earthly place for those particular karmic issues again. That doesn't mean that I'll never have to come here for other reasons. That's all up to God. But that's what's happening, and you move into those rites of the ascension, which is very similar. You go into the Book of the Eights, which has to do with the Book of Immortality, which is something that I received when I was going through the initiations into the mysteries, which was earlier, but you receive your name into the Book of the Eights, and then the writing of the Book of the Eights is part of the process of becoming immortal, which is not a physical immortal, it's a spiritual immortal. It's a spiritual attainment, not a physical one. I remember Key. He was one of the masters, the rites of ascension, and his name was Key. He would travel through all of these different realms, taking the complexity and bringing it back to simplicity. But it's the complexity is all of it. It's the whole karmic thrust. It's all the paths that you've gone on where you've gotten lost, but it's also all of this knowledge you've gained about these different religions, these different paths, these different mysteries along the way. And it's all of these things that you've learned about your soul and yourself and the things that you're trying to change and alter as you're going. And it's all coming back. You're realizing that everything that you have been seeking has been external, and you're bringing it back to the internal. And as you bring it back to the internal, it's going to then rise up again because it's going to go back towards God. But this is the beginning phases, these first 8 phases where you're still going from this karmic path, which is very external, and then bringing it back to the internal and realizing that everything you've been seeking outside of yourself is what you have to seek from within. The alteration pathway deals a lot with how we learn to identify energetic truth, which is God's truth behind the reality of what is going on behind the interaction or interplay that is going to occur in energy before it hits the ground. You can have the exact same circumstances and it can have a completely different energetic truth based on intention or non-intention, ignorance or knowledge. It's all kinds of things. And we don't know that because we don't know the heart of man. Only God knows the heart of an individual soul. And that is how it is revealed to us energetically and mystically through the energetic truth. Now, the alteration pathway deals with this much bigger scheme of things, and it deals with the place I call the management realm, for lack of a better word, where things form in energy before they hit the ground. This is the realm where a lot of psychics will tune into when they are giving their readings, and that's why sometimes they will tune into things that have slightly different outcomes, because in the management realm, you have things forming which are forming because of thoughts, words, deeds, actions, and stuff that is happening, but that can alter and change as those things change. Now, in the alteration pathway, we are learning how, when it is appropriate and according to God's will, that the angelic kingdom will send souls in to go in and alter the outcome of an event or events, so that someone will not have an outcome which would be detrimental to their soul purpose or what they are here to learn. And of course, this is, again, all based on the energetic truth as determined by God, not by us, not by the angels. And so why or how God chooses when to intervene and when not to is all part of God's mystery, and we are just participants in it. But we learn that we can enter into the management realm and we can actually change the energy. We can alter an event, we can move somebody out of the way, and we can change the outcome of an event as it hits the ground, so that either someone doesn't get killed, maybe they're still involved in an event, but they manage not to get killed. Someone gets an alteration in the way they're thinking, so they make a different choice. It can be any number of alterations. And then we also, as we're going through the alteration pathway, we're learning about altering those things within our own psyche, our own soul, which we learn as we are learning to do this on the grander scale. We learn about our own flaws in our own thinking and how we can learn to alter those. The rites into the medicine begin with really cool things. I was very honored to be accompanied by Chief Joseph, who took me through this pathway. He came in, there were quite a few things that I was given to see about the path of life, the path of death, what happens when things go awry. I'll give you a point that kind of defines the beginning of the rites of the medicine, because the journey starts. Chief Joseph is meeting me nightly pretty much, and I'm sitting at the campfire right outside his teepee. There's several nights where the other elders are chanting and it's beautiful. I'm being pulled into these things which are showing me either my own past lifetimes, taking me into other things about good and evil, and then good and evil within myself, and all sorts of things. But there's one defining event, moment, where it kind of tells you where Chief Joseph is going to take me. I'm allowed to watch from above a previous lifetime where I was in a Southern home during the Civil War, and I was not against slavery. And I was watching this and I was like, what? Really confused by it, because I couldn't imagine that I would have ever had a lifetime where I might have had that kind of a view. And so I'm watching all this stuff, and I had a husband who was going off to fight for the Confederacy. Chief Joseph is just calmly standing beside me, and he says, is it possible that if you had a lifetime where you once did not think there was anything wrong with slavery, that you might have some beliefs now that are not life-giving, that are not life-supporting? That's where you begin, where you start examining the things within that have been yet unexamined. And so that's where the medicine begins, and you start with the ancient chanters. You start seeing some of the medicine women, but it goes much deeper as you go with the medicine women. This is where it begins. You start with a lot of different alterations. So you start working in the management realms. Chief Joseph is teaching me about this ball of light that he's given me to work with, that I have in my hands, and how I can utilize it in the management realm to change and move things around and alter the outcome of events. I'm doing a lot of trial and error, and I'm making progress, and then we move into the next area. Chief Joseph takes it into the next level. And this is where you start learning about how does evolution occur within a soul? And then how does that actually work on a larger scale in terms of like humanity or a people or whatever? And he starts out with this tobacco seed, and he talks about the different forms when it's a seed, when it's in a pipe, when it's ash. And he has this beautiful analogy where he explains literally how we go from this substance to this next place, and then literally to ash. This is hard for people to relate to, I think, but when you go to the ash, it's when you're literally getting rid of the forms, the attachments, and you're starting to see things from a higher perspective. But there's more to it. It's a long journey. There's a lot more about good and evil. But again, in this path, in the discrimination pathway, you're dealing more with darkness and light, which is more of dominant darkness, ignorance, and light versus real evil. You deal more with real evil as you go into discipline. So the rites of evolution are going to take you more deeply into understanding how the subtle changes occur in a soul as they take these individual steps. And there's a lot of these individual meetings with Chief Joseph where he's teaching me around the campfire with a lot of his cute little allegories that I loved. And then also with him showing me stuff. He shows me a lot of things about myself, and he shows me a lot of things just about how darkness and light interact and the eternal law. We begin to really deal with eternal law in the rites of evolution. And eternal law is the higher law that the spirit world operates from, which has nothing to do with earthly law. It has to do with the eternal law, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier, like how St. Michael can go take the demons out who are not given dominion by or permission by someone's thoughts, words, or deeds. But that eternal law prevents him from removing the others, not because he can't, it's because eternal law prevents it, because that is the dominion here. You learn about these eternal laws and what are violations of eternal law, and how do you abide by eternal law when you are dealing with the alteration realms, because you are moving into an energy and a place where you must do only the will of God, nothing more, nothing less, or you risk being in violation of that. The final phase of it, where you are able to see these alterations in real action, where you're seeing how they hit the ground. This is where you're kind of on the cusp of when you're coming into the discipline pathway, where you're going to really deal with evil. And it was at the end of that alteration of reality path that I dealt with my first really evil situation, and I had to observe. Christ came and took me to take this soul to see the Council of 12, where the second death was pronounced upon him. And I was really freaked out by it, but Christ said to me, he repeated it twice. He said, "It is not for you to understand, it is just for you to know." It is not for you to understand, it is just for you to know. He was trying to prepare me for the fact that God intervenes when we're dealing with ignorance, when we're dealing with unintentional acts that are based on variations of lower levels of intention. But when you get to true evil, there is justice. That's what you're learning there in the end is, okay, so now you're dealing with the lower level alterations and you're learning how to do these from the management realm. The management realm is all of this stuff which is third and fourth dimensional. The pathway of discrimination has to do with yourself on these levels. When you get to the discipline path, you're going to be hitting that multi-dimensional where you're going to hit the purgatories and the hells. When you hit discipline, you're dealing with an infinite number of purgatories, an infinite number of hells, and it really gets vast then. You're moving into a much wider entrance, and so it's quite the break there, because what you're learning in discrimination is the lower level understanding of how to manipulate and understand and alter your more regular level, low level darkness based on ignorance and not hugely intentional types of evil. This understanding your own things that are generally usually not intentional. A lot of times you're not even aware of them. And so you become aware of them. That's a real important part of it. You're going to start hitting an even deeper examination that takes you in even deeper realms. The beginning of this path can be pretty excruciatingly brutal in the sense of the types of things that you're put through, because you end up going into almost like the same type of awareness, life review type thing you would at death. And so you're hit with this really profound awareness of your own sin. A profound part of this in the beginning where you are weeping for your own sin, your own failings. You're seeing things that you did not see. A big hallmark of this moment is the realization that you could have ever judged, when now you realize your own defects, and they're so much greater than you could have ever realized, and that you need so much mercy from God yourself that you're like, I can't believe that I would ever deny mercy to anyone else. So there's this real humbling going on. I mean, a humbling and a rumbling. You're talking about depth and tears and crying, and I mean really like getting it. This is where you're really like seeing your defects and really weeping for your defects. This is where true contrition is really taking hold. You're getting it. You're getting whatever it is that you're being shown about yourself. in the ancient sacred paths. In my case, I was taken to see some monks who were deep underground doing some chanting to bring about these things that were going to happen, which was starting to prepare me for the journey to come, which was going to be pretty intense. I had some of my most powerful experiences in this ancient sacred paths period. First of all, the Blessed Virgin Mother came to me, and she came with this commando type people. They were like soldiers. And she said, it's time to learn about the darkness and evil. Okay, so I'm beginning my training, and I'm like, okay, that's not what I was hoping for. Not what I was expecting at all. I went through these beautiful experiences that were also very intense. It started with that whole life review type thing. And then after you have that humbling, deep contrition thing, I had this beautiful, intensely beautiful experience with the Buddha. I was taken into wonderment, devotion, and humility. And I was taken into the energy of it. And so, one of the things that happens in these out-of-body travel paths is that a lot of times, sometimes you're taken low and then you are lifted up again once you have gotten the message of being taken low. So I was taken up again and taken into this unbelievable energy of wonderment, devotion, and humility. Buddha was there hovering with me. It was just so awesome. And this was when Jesus and the Buddha came to me as well and told me, retrieve the ancient sacred texts. So up until this point, I had not been studying the ancient sacred texts. This was when they told me to retrieve them. And I was like, what? And then he said, and the ancient prayer books. And so I was given that instruction. And of course, I've been doing it ever since. It's been 30 years, gathering it. Well, there's another one. So there's the preparation here is that you are going into these ancient sacred paths with the Buddha, with Christ. One of the things that I went through too was I was allowed to witness the formation of the Messiah. So I was seeing Christ as he was, the rumbling as he was becoming the Messiah. It was just the birth point of Christ. It wasn't the birth point of him as a baby. It was the birth point of that energy of what he was to do. And it was amazing. Entry into the ancient sacred paths began for me with Jesus and with the Buddha, but it would continue throughout the discipline pathway with many of these religious paths, which I share as I go through these other paths with the Baha'i, Islam, the Urantia book, with Judaism, with Hinduism, Jainism, and Sikhism, and all sorts of isms, and Zoroastrianism, of course, because, I saw him later, and that was awesome. That's what that part was. And then it proceeds into that next phase. Yes. And so that's what then hits right there. When I was doing the commando training, I had to start learning how to hold in my light so that I could travel into hell realms. And I was going with the commandos, and they would teach me to do this because if you show your light, you might just get gobbled up, because if they see that you're there and they realize that you're coming in from the light, they're going to come after you. So there's all these things that you have to do to learn to enter into these realms to be able to assist, but without being identified or spotted or getting into any trouble. And so you start with that training, and then you start learning about the different demons. And so I had this beautiful journey to the islands of the demons, where I was taken to see the demons of the common man. These were demons of lust and rage and the Lord demon and the demons of pride and belligerence against God, lots of demons. So you learn about these demons of the common man, and then you start traveling into some of these hell realms, like Muddy Flats, which is for vanity and greed, the good old Muddy Flats, and some of these other places. I think it was in this period that I actually went through my temptation with Satan himself. And that was pretty intense. And that's what happens there as you enter into the lower realms. Self-scrutiny, heavy into the ancient sacred texts now. You're learning from all the prophets, saints, mystics, and the sages, not just from their writings, but also they are coming and they are teaching you. And so you are doing a very intrusive self-scrutiny of your own defects. And you're getting better at this in the sense that you don't take it so personally when you mess up. So you're becoming more capable of being taught, because now you're able to receive that criticism and actually become quicker at responding to it in a constructive way, rather than the intensity which begins at the beginning. But that intensity is necessary at different points during the path, and definitely at the beginning, because we have to generate the original humility in order to really follow the path. Original sin is when we really learn about the things that we pick up come from all around us. And so it goes into the original sin of our families, the original sin of our own karmic pasts, the original sin of our societies, our communities, the original sin of our culture, our particular country, and how we delineate, and that we have to actually learn how to discern the difference between a cultural norm and something termed or discerned as original sin, something that would be going against life or against God. And so we then have to understand that original sin is not just the propensity to be able to commit sin, as in the fall of man. It is recognizing the elements that are affecting us. So again, a reminder, let's go back. It's the personal karmic thrusts that we bring into this life. Every family has their own dynamics and generates their own original sins and some of their own original virtues. So all those things apply. The communities that we live in, countries that we live in, the society that we live in, the people that we choose to associate with. And so all of these things, the secular world and what we choose, we have to learn how to discern what are the basic elements that are accepted as truth that might actually be false in God's eyes, that we need to take a closer look at and possibly alter in order to move further towards God and away from a habitual sin or vice that seems like just what everyone else is doing. That's when I was taken into the mysteries of the redemption. And I had these two grand visions during this period, and there were a lot of other things as well, but I was taken into, literally, this is when I was told the book was going to be called The Mysteries of the Redemption. I was taken into this energetic panoply and literally saw how the mysteries of the redemption played out before me. It was something that is so hard to put in words. It was just so beautiful. And during this period as well, I was also shown how in the New Testament, how the mysteries of the redemption and the book showed and demonstrated what was taught in the Gospels of how the mystery of the redemption played itself out. And that is how the mystery of the redemption plays itself out in the soul, because we are here to be redeemed. And what does it mean to be redeemed? We have to hand ourselves back over to God and let ourselves be reseated back. And this redemption process means that we become a new creation. I was taken into the Last Supper, and I was taken into the crucifixion and really cool stuff. I'm trying to remember the words that were in the sky when I was seeing the mysteries. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. It's from songs. These are songs that are old songs, and they were emblazoned in the sky. And Jesus appeared, the clouds open. They were emblazoned in the sky, and there were the angelic hosts and this energy that was forming that showed how the redemption occurs energetically. Knowledge is vibration, not information. It occurs through vibration. The redemption is everything. It's everything. It's what we come here to do, to be redeemed. It's to overcome our sinful nature, to overturn our karmic past, and to embrace the light of God and walk forward into our future in the light. And that's what we come here to do. And, if you'll remember too, there was a scene in the Discrimination Pathway with Chief Joseph where he's talking about, well, this is what you've done. And I'm like, but I haven't done enough. And he said, but it was like he was pointing out, but there's so few who have done what you've done. And that it was like it was greatly appreciated that I did it. And I was still thinking, it's not enough. It's still not enough. I've got to keep going. And we don't realize, even along the way, even going back to the initiations, I was before the Council of 12, and it was Easter Island. I was being asked questions about what I had achieved as to, to go to the next initiation. And I said, well, I don't make very much money, but I've done a lot of spiritual stuff. And they were laughing about the money thing because they said that's not the type of attainment that we seek. And so they were laughing about it because, our worldly value is, gosh, I don't make very much money. They were happy with the real resume that I had, which was that I was seeking these spiritual things, but I had this low self-esteem. All along the way, you see this common thread, which is the seeking that you're doing. What is of value is the redemption, it's the cultivation, it's the purification, it's the work that goes into actually overcoming the sinful nature, the karmic thrust, and going into a higher expression of ourselves, which we cannot become if we do not do these things. We have to do these things in order to attain to that. And so the celebration is when a soul achieves that, there's great happiness about it. celebrations that they would do for different steps along the way, which was really neat. I remember they did they got all excited about when I finished The Voice of the Prophets, which was that encyclopedia of ancient sacred texts. It was a big deal, and I was surprised because I was like, really? Okay, I didn't realize that was a big deal. Okay, cool. It is paved with deceit. It's really not about fairness, because there are so many people that I have seen throughout my life who have legitimately and very honestly fallen off away from the path of the light and truly honestly believe that they did not. We listen to the things that make us feel good. We listen to the things that we want to hear. The real work of the purification process is that we are reforming our conscience. And so when we come into the discrimination process, what the real work here is that we have to take this newly formed conscience and actually apply it to our lives in a painful way. Mother Teresa would say, we have to love until it hurts. I don't think people really understand that unless they really just take a moment, maybe a lot of moments, to think about what does that mean. Let's think about what she's saying. Let's look at her life, for one. Mother Teresa loved until it hurt. How many people view love as something that is only meant to feed them? But Mother Teresa understood that God had asked her to love in a self-emptying manner, so that everything that her life became was, she became a funnel where God's love moved, and it was moving towards everyone else. And it hurt. This is what we learned when her letters came out and she had this darkness in her life. She loved until it really hurt, because she had to self-sacrifice to do that. She was not doing this because it made her feel good or full. She did it, and it was hard. And discrimination is hard because it asks difficult things of us. And this is where a lot of people fall away. They don't want to do the difficult work, which requires us to make changes in our lives, to make decisions that we don't want to make, to change the way we view things, and therefore then change the way we do things to make right the things we have done wrong. When I went through the discrimination pathway, I would receive instructions about sending letters to people that I had harmed 20 years ago, apology letters, explaining to them my new insight into what I had done to harm them. I had to do a lot of things that were uncomfortable. They were very uncomfortable. And then I had to make new kinds of decisions that changed the way my life was going, that made my life more difficult. God asked things of me, like, for instance, give everything away for free, and you're just gonna have to trust me. He asks you, just as, Mother Teresa was given that too. Mother Angelica, who founded the Eternal Word television network, had to trust that, okay, you're just going to do that. You're going to build that television tower, and you're going to trust that somehow the financial means to do it is going to show up. So there's a lot of trust you're putting into doing what God is asking of you. And it's hard. You have to work hard. You're asked to work even harder because, again, we go back to the whole directive I talk about, which is we are always asked to give back to creation that which creation gives to us. And we can't forget that, because there is nothing unjust about being asked to give everything away for free. If God asks it, it is because I have received so much more. And if he asks it, it's because he will make it possible for me to do that. He might ask me to work other jobs and also maintain this at the same time. But these will be things that are difficult that I deal with, I've done in order to make these things happen. But it's also in the discrimination process. It's just the excruciating self-examination, because you are literally going through that life review that we often wait till the end of our lives for. But the benefit of doing it now is that you are correcting the path. And so you're correcting the misviews, the things that you haven't seen, your incorrect perceptions about life versus death, versus what is good versus what is evil, versus what is life-giving, what's more life-taking. All these things reform you. And by reforming you, it literally changes your entire destiny, alters the direction your life is taking, and everything is going to change. It's very exhausting, takes a lot of work. People around you may not understand. You may have to accept losing people who can't travel it with you, who can't understand it, who just don't support it. The pathway is not an easy one. And that's why Mother Teresa said, love until it hurts. St. Padre Pio, I just felt an energy shift, so I'm paying attention. That was a strong switch. St. Padre Pio spoke about this time with the 3 days of darkness. That was something that was going to come around the times of the apocalypse. There are a lot of different ways that these types of things can play out, but what we are looking at is that the chaos that is going on inside of the human soul and inside of each one of us is now becoming external. Human beings have been given this fun little trick of being able to put on false faces and being able to cover up things that are going on underneath as part of our things. It's not like that in the spirit world. In the spirit world, when we cross over, when we die, in the afterlife, what we are is what we become. So whatever it is that we're compatible with is what we appear to be. We immediately morph into what that reality truly is, not what we are able to make it appear to be or look like. And in the human form, we've made it an art to deceive and to be untrue to our interior and to give lip service to the things that absolutely matter, the things that actually are of substance and worth and value, and to our Creator God. We have offended Almighty God with our arrogance. There's so much sacrilege and blasphemy that goes on in our world now. We are so desensitized to it. I think the majority of people would not even realize an act of sacrilege or blasphemy if it was happening right in front of them. And that's how far we've gone. Think Sodom and Gomorrah, and that's what we're at. And think about what happened there. It was completely destroyed. When a human society, think about times of Noah. What happened there, and it was completely destroyed. It had to start over, so to speak. When the plan for humanity gets so far astray, the plan for the human soul is so far away from its original construct and its original intention and its original purpose, then things have to change in some way, shape, or form. And so things are either created or allowed. This doesn't necessarily mean, and this is the hard part for people to understand, there can be things that will be created, and we have to remember we're creating them. We're creating these circumstances by the nature of who we have all become. We've done it. God isn't doing anything to us. We're doing it all to ourselves. Okay, so there's creating it, and then there's allowing it. This is where the discrimination process comes in, because part of the difficulty is that so many souls do not realize that they are magnetizing demonic forces into their lives because they have not even examined their thoughts. They haven't examined their lives or their deeds. And this is the thing. Well, that's not a big deal. Well, they don't really know because they haven't actually done any of the work. There's a mystical and ascetical theology, the science of the examination of the soul, the purification of the soul. It's ironically, it's also this threefold process of purification, discrimination, and discipline. That's what mystical and ascetical theology are all about. That's why I recommend to people the reading of those mystical theology texts, and there are some at the website that you can actually download, like The Spiritual Life by Father Adolphe Tanqueray, and also The Three Ages of the Interior Life by Father Garrigou-Lagrange. These are texts that go through this examine on the deeper levels with you. Ironically, even just beginning this process, starting this process of doing this physically is something that energizes it mystically. It creates that energy that moves people into having more out-of-body experiences wherein they are shown about themselves. It's tough to get people open to realizing that this is a true need for all of us, not just people who are in the religious life. This is the work of our life. This is the work of our soul. We don't want to waste our time here. Part of the reason we see so much chaos and stuff around us is because people have given up these practices which help us to actually cultivate the soul. And that cultivation is pivotal in the journey of a human soul in a mortal realm. And so we are seeing this, everything is thrown out of balance because people are not realizing they're missing the whole point of why they're here. Now remember how the importance of bringing all of those pieces into the one vessel? So they still have that importance, but the reason they have this importance is because their importance is vastly greater when that memory comes together as one, rather than you just have this little fragment that exists by itself, that by itself cannot really attain much spiritually because that it's not connected with all of this other experience or with the universal consciousness or the higher self from which it came. But by the very process of that initiation and bringing all these parts together, all of those fragments have now joined into the soul. So they're all there, all those experiences, but it's a different thing once that happens and once the ascension happens, because a soul is going towards death into life consciously, whereas a soul who doesn't awaken during life experiences a different kind of death. It's not that they cease to exist, because the personality, the life that they lived, was not connected to all of the other elements. When we just are separated from all of life, it makes it mortal. The personality will, in a sense, it will go through a death at the time of death. Whereas someone who is awakened during life, it's not going to be the same thing, because the personality has no need to die. It's already been transformed. It's going to continue to evolve and transcend and go higher. It's a different kind of transition. People who have not awakened during life do not die either, but their personality will experience an ending. Just to make sure it's clear, because people can misunderstand this very easily. You don't have to have been a major out-of-body traveler or a mystic to achieve that. It helps. It's one way. One of the things that I do is help people who are crossing over from life in their afterlife journeys. And I can tell you the prime objective has to do with this, all these things I'm talking about with the mystical theology, this examination, the reformation of the consciousness. I've taken many souls who have gone to the highest immortal realms, who were very grounded individuals in their life. They were not mystical, they didn't read mystical texts, but they did self-formation. And so they did that. They were very aware of cultivating themselves. And so it's important to realize that this is not just something that can only occur if you're having lots of out-of-body experiences. I have taken souls to high immortal realms who were just very, very diligent in their self-study and their self-evaluation. You know, they went through these processes, but they went through them in a different way. And they certainly probably would not have called it that while they were alive. Do you see? So, you know, God works in mysterious ways, so we don't want to limit that. We don't want to limit God, because he does it in his way. St. Padre Pio would say that spiritual reading was essential for the spiritual path. And this is part of the reason he did. Daily spiritual reading was essential for the spiritual path, is because people don't realize that is part of how we keep that continual flow of the energy of the formation moving. And, you know, even in my own practice, if I get out of the habit of doing the spiritual reading and I'm not having the kinds of experiences I want to have, I know all I've got to do is pick out one of these books that I have, get back into my daily spiritual reading, and it's going to immediately renew the gift. And that's part of the reason I want to point this out. It's not a new concept. Many of the saints and the great spiritual teachers, not just Catholic, have said these things about how important it is that you are feeding your soul with that daily spiritual reading. And so I want to throw that out there. It's important for people to realize it's just as important as the prayer and meditation. When we talk about the prayer, talking to God, meditation, listening to God, but you know, the spiritual reading is allowing God to speak to us through one of his instruments. And you know, we've had so many amazing instruments of God in the ancient sacred texts and all those writings that I'm always talking about. Every time we allow ourselves to partake from those, we are literally allowing God to speak to us in the way that he spoke through one of his beloved souls that he chose to speak through. And so we forget what an amazing gift that is to us, that we can actually partake of that. And it wasn't that long ago. It was just pre-internet days when many of these texts were really hard to find. They were out of print. Now we have gotten so many of these things back into print and available for us to restore and create that tradition. A lot of it's available for free online too. Take advantage of the work that God has already done in speaking to humanity through many of his souls that sat and listened to him. Self-delusion, that's a big one, and that is so important to every living soul. And I'll start this with when I was 29, I had this experience. I was shown my whole life from a different context, and I was able to see that everything I had ever done was for self-serving motivation. So even the good things that I had done had been for self-serving motivations. And I remember that when I came out of this, it was like 2 weeks of really being a mess. Like, oh my God, your full cup has just been spilled over, and everything that you thought was in that cup has now been labeled as irrelevant. One of my spiritual counseling clients, who would not mind if I shared this, who has been struggling for quite some time. And I had been working with this person and struggling to get a breakthrough on the fact that the focus was on worldly pursuits, and that they couldn't see that this had turned them in a completely different direction than what God would have wished for them. And there was this relativistic attitude that we see with people where, what's the big deal? Who's it hurting? What's wrong with that? I just like doing this. And so this morning, that particular client contacted me to let me know that they had had a vision that I've been praying for probably a year. And it's a similar vision, but it was a vision where this person was shown their self-delusion. The things that they had perceived were false. And the things that they were angry about at other people, they actually were able to see that their own failure, their own fault in the events. They were given to see what was real versus what was illusion. This person had been persecuting something that was quite real in God's kingdom, and had been working very strongly in this whole worldly construct thing that we all do, the world. But this person was also very much like I was when I had that experience myself, and I've had more of those, by the way, not just that one. But this soul was able to literally see that, oh, my cup wasn't full. Everything was just spilled out over last night, because they saw that everything they had put in that cup was meaningless. It was pointless. Not only was it meaningless and pointless, it was false. And not only was it meaningless, pointless, and false, they were wrong. Not only was it meaningless, pointless, false, and were they wrong, they were actually going against God and not realizing it. And that's what pushed this client a little over the edge in realizing, but I don't want to do that. That's not what I set out to do. But somehow I didn't see it. And so this self-delusion is something that we all are vulnerable to. We're all capable of it. We're all easily very capable of it, because we are very easily given to justifying selfish pursuits, justifying worldly gain of all sorts. And what we often don't realize, we say, okay, well, who's it hurting? What's the big deal? Well, if you come here with a specific spiritual purpose that you are completely unable to fulfill because your glass is full with all of this false, delusional, pointless pursuits that is actually going against God, well, what do you say to that? Then you've got a problem, right? So what's happening is people are getting very lost by their worldly full cups. And they're not even realizing that what needs to be developed, nurtured, and created, pursued, disciplined in this life is not even being touched upon by almost all humanity. I don't even know how we would quantify that. 90% of human life is ignoring the purpose of their incarnation. So, wow, that's kind of serious, right? And so that's why it becomes so important then to actually learn how to discern. Ironically, the Catholic Church, other faiths, and the mystical experience itself takes you through mystical training. But even in the Catholic faith and in other religious paths, there is a process that you can go through to learn, even if you're not having mystical experiences, where you can start understanding some basic fundamentals of discernment. So you can start looking at your full glass and looking at it with a different eye, so that you might not be so inclined to just ignore things that might really be holding you back, really be hindering you from making progress in this life, in this world. I think most humans, if we die and we cross over and we face what happens in the afterlife, and we realize that we've kind of missed the point of why we were born here. We didn't do anything. And in many cases, we actually did things that turned us further away from the directions that we needed to go. I think most humans would say, no, that is not the outcome that I'm hoping for myself. We would all probably say that. But most humans would also not be willing to do that self-scrutiny that's required to actually see whether or not that's what they're actually doing. Another way to look at this, another angle, one of the things that I also think is fascinating is even just listening to the various near-death experiences that people have had, and people have put hundreds of them on the internet now, because every one of those experiences is offering us a different eye point view of God. It shows us something new about God that we didn't know before. So all of those things are, in a sense, it's allowing us to tune into ways of seeing God that we couldn't have if we weren't open. It's a really important thing because we're allowing ourselves to partake of how God has spoken to other souls. And it's different. We have different cultures, different religions, different corners of the world. This is the way that we learn the many facets of God's presence, which is like a diamond. You get to know God by getting to know his friends.